Hey, welcome back everyone to Insight session today on how to adopt as a service models. I'm Jason Rader, and with me today I have my two colleagues, Kent Christensen, who's our Cloud Practice Director, and Juan Orlandini, who's our Chief Architect here at Insight Cloud and Data Center Transformation. Good morning, gentlemen.
All right, good morning, Jason. How are you?
I'm excellent.
Morning, Jason.
Good morning, Kent. So let's kick this off. How about Juan? Why don't you define as a service models for me? What does that mean?
Sure. So there's lots of flavors of it. So let me actually do something might be a little bit different than a direct answer to your question. So there's actually as a service is just like CapEx, OpEx, and a cloud consumption model, just a different financial mechanism for getting stuff. And that stuff can vary, and we'll talk about that later. But the more traditional OpEx, that's where you buy something and you literally write a check for the full amount. You might have to pay for a certain amount of maintenance that you re-up every year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever the contract is. But that's the OpEx model, right?
CapEx.
So the good part about that one, sorry, Ken, is that OpEx is really a way of acquiring that stuff. It goes on your books. It's a liability, not a liability, but an asset on your books. And it's kind of an expensive way to start a project if you don't know how that project is going to go. But it might be a better way of doing things if you have a longer term view, maybe 3, 4, 5 years worth of stuff to do. Another way to address that spending model is what's been known as OpEx models, operational expenses. And those are typically leases, right? And leases tend to be more a mechanism of having, just like a car, where you pay a certain amount every month. It's lower than if you had purchased a car outright. But there's a downside to that, is that you actually pay a little bit extra because there's an interest rate associated with it, but you're still getting something that's been pre-configured, pre-designed, and you're just extending payments over time. All right, so a little bit different than CapEx, but now FASB actually has rules that is also put on your books like an asset. So you have to manage the depreciation and all that other stuff. The third model, which is what you asked me from originally, and I'm finally getting there, right, is as a service. And that's where you literally pay for a thing like storage or compute or whatever it is that you're trying to get on a monthly basis. And you only pay for what you are consuming, right? But you also have the ability to do a flex up, so you can consume more. And if you're not consuming more, you consume less. And that's called flex down. So it's a more manageable way of doing that. But that also comes with a premium above what you would have paid for OpEx, right? But there's some pluses and minuses, and we'll talk about that as we go, because you have some choices. If you're not consuming as much and your payment goes down, then heck, it's that might actually save you some money. Right, and the final one is cloud consumption model. In the cloud consumption model, you literally are swiping a credit card. There's no upfront fee. There's no minimums, which there might be in as a service model. You consume what you consume. You don't consume what you don't consume. You don't pay for it. But that potentially could come at a much higher premium because you're paying for everything. So, and as a service, you don't pay, for example, in storage, for ingress and egress costs of the stuff coming in and coming out of the storage. In a cloud consumption model, you pay not only for the storage itself, but for all of the IOs and the ins and outs and all that other stuff. So, but it gives you the most flexibility. They're all great tools of spending money. So, Ken, I talked right over you. I'm sorry.
No, I think you inadvertently said OpEx when you meant CapEx to start. So with that, but yeah, I think I agree 100%. And the as a service is really new, and as we get going, we start to even subdivide those into which ones are pure services, really aligned to what Juan was describing as cloud consumption, and which ones are based on a configuration of infrastructure.
Okay. So I thought that was an easy question, but apparently it doesn't sound like it is. So, and no, I think the explanation was fantastic. So it sounds like this is not a technology discussion. Is that right, guys?
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's not a technology discussion. All right. So this is a financial model. All right. It's a way of managing your stuff, but it can very much tie into a technology decision. All right. one of the conversations that Kent and I actually had this morning is, how does this tie into something like a cloud native initiative? So a lot of our clients are wanting to build on-premises private infrastructure clouds, right? And these clouds are different than what we built in the past as private clouds, because they're developer centric. They might be focused on DevOps, microservices, those kinds of things, right? And the problem with that, though, is that one of the key driving aspects of the DevOps movement and the agile methodology and all that is that you start small, then you try iterate, and then you fail fast. And if you fail, you want to be out, right? If you're buying the stuff ahead of time, it's really hard to fail fast because you've already bought the thing, right? Whereas with as a service, well, you stop paying for it and you're done. And that's exactly what you do in the public cloud, but now you can potentially do that on premises. So it's a financial model plus also maybe a technology enabler in many ways.
I love
that. Just to add one
ahead.
thing. I think when we speak as a service in this context, what we're seeing is it's kind of a new financial model, 100% correct, right? I don't want to CapEx purchase my infrastructure anymore, either because the recent events of the pandemic have slowed down my visibility to my business, or because I think I'm going to cloud. But what we're seeing is most of the people are looking at this as a way to consume what you need, like Juan was talking about, and it's mostly for private infrastructure. So today what they're using is these as a service models is a new way to consume private infrastructure versus CapEx versus lease.
Okay, so this sounds like, not only does this sound like from a transformation type perspective in an organization, it also sounds like something that a lot of folks are concerned about these days with a lot of liquidity issues related to cash flow within their organizations. Are you hearing this conversation more these days, I would assume?
Yeah, absolutely. I end up being in front of a lot of clients, and I see really two big areas. And we've seen a lot of analysts talk about what's going to happen with pay-as-you-go or consumption services moving forward. And they're anywhere from 20% of all infrastructure purchased in data centers will be as a service. I saw an IDC or one that said it will be up to 50% by 2024. So people are interested in this. And there's two really different models, right? One of them is, let's call it our pre-COVID model, that said some companies, some organizations were worried about their migration to cloud. They realistically don't know how fast I can get 5 petabytes of storage out to the cloud, and so they want to hedge the bet. And if they can consume similar to cloud and have that flexibility to go down in their on-premise, that gives them visibility and takes out that risk, right? Now, a lot of organizations have uncertainty about the entire business model. I don't know if business is up or down 20%, even in federal organizations, hey, what's my funding going to be given
Right.
That's all crazy. And so it gives them that flexibility and essentially takes risk out.
Okay. And so I know just about, we're talking about storage, you just did. And I know a lot of folks are having this kind of as a service approach from a storage perspective, but are they all the same? Because Juan kind of mentioned this flex up, flex down type capability. Is that the case with storage even?
We kind of breaking this down into, because I think we have a luxury at Insight that we can deliver these services. Not everybody who's been used to selling infrastructure primarily through CapEx or lease is ready for this. And we're very fortunate that we can kind of broker these out. So they are all talking to us. And we did break them into two large categories. One of them is, when you say as a service, is your pricing up front? Am I really consuming by the whatever, by the drink? If it's compute, am I consuming by the server? If it's storage, am I consuming by the terabyte, et cetera? And then the other one is what we'll call config-based, right? Hey, I'll tell you how much your as a service is after you put together a configuration, and then I'm going to probably go through and figure out some financing with that. So those are the two general ones. And it ends up that the storage guys were the first ones to come in and truly do as a service. So we've seen, companies like NetApp and Pure really come in and say, you know what, storage is sticky. And when you think about cloud, it's the hard part, right? For all of these different reasons, a whole other webcast of why is storage and cloud hard. And so they actually stepped forward and said, look, I want to be part of, the journey, whether it stays on-prem or some goes to cloud, I'll be there for both. And so they introduced the true, how much is it per terabyte? It's X per terabyte. And some of the other providers that provide all kinds of infrastructure are kind of like, put together a configuration, we'll figure it out, and we'll give you as a service-like capabilities.
All right. That's interesting.
Yeah, sorry, and Jason, you asked a question in your question about flexing up, flexing down, and all that other stuff. And the answer to that a little bit more specifically is that there absolutely is some that can flex up, but not flex down. Some that can flex up and flex down. So the devil's in the details, right? And that's part of the thing, is not all of these programs are created equal. And that's what Kent was talking about, is that we got to be very mindful of how we approach these, because it might depend on the technology partner that we work with, whether we can have that flex up or flex down. Whereas some are limited to just storage. Some are more expansive in what they offer, so it could be compute and storage and networking and whatever else, right? So it's very much we need to work with clients to understand what their technology needs, what their business needs are, and based on that, then finally make the decision as to which one of these programs we should consume and spend or approach the solution with.
Yeah, and that's really a good point. Somebody's going to take the risk. So if it's a lease and it goes on your books as a lease, if you lease 10 cars and go for a mortgage, you're not that solvent. So somebody's got to take the risk. And what the storage companies did was said, I'm going to take a risk. I might send you $1 million of infrastructure to provide a service. It's not on your books. You don't have a long-term commitment, all of those things. So they took risk. Some of the other programs that are, let's say, config-based, and I don't want to generalize them all, but some of them are going through a config-based, and somewhere in there, they're saying, what's my risk? And so there may be, hey, I can flex up, but if you terminate early, there's a clause, and then it's really up to your financial organization and your auditors to determine, is that a liability or is that really a true OpEx?
Okay. So gentlemen, let me throw this out. And by the way, everybody knows these are unscripted, right? But I haven't we've never talked about this before, but it sounds like I've got two questions. Because one, when you initially talked, you talked about I thought as a service was all the same, but obviously it's not. I really didn't, but I'm playing devil's advocate here, right? So if that's the case, am I locked? Can I do as a service from a public cloud perspective? Or do I have to go with the same public cloud provider? Am I kind of locked in when I go as a service one way? Or you talked about a model where people are building private infrastructure that modeled after public cloud technologies. And so how kind of locked in? And the reason I ask this question is because it sounds like if we were talking storage, which we were a couple seconds ago, it sounds like the storage folks could make a decision that maybe affects the rest of the strategy for the organization if we're not playing these cards correctly.
So there's a lot to unpack in that question.
Of course, yeah. We have an hour.
Yeah, well, it's all good. So let's talk about, first of all, these as a service things that we've been talking about are all on-premises stuff. All right, so it would be stuff that would go into your data center. It's related to the public cloud stuff, and that it's a similar consumption model, but it's not stuff that you run in the public cloud. All right. Okay. So think about it that way. This is a way of getting stuff into a data center that is just being bought or consumed differently. But from a technology perspective, you still have to go through the exact same processes that you would have done in the past if you were making a CapEx or an OpEx acquisition, all right? You have to make sure that it's the right storage, the right compute, the right networking, whatever aspects we're talking about, and make sure that those actually meet your business requirements. So the fact that you can buy it better doesn't necessarily mean that you're buying the right thing. Right? I sure would like to have a really fancy Ferrari, but that's probably not a thing that makes sense for me in many, many ways, including my wife not liking it, right? So organizations are very similar to that, is that if you're looking at it as a service for storage, You look at any one of the major storage providers, they all have an as a service thing. So is that storage partner or provider the right thing for your business? It might be somebody that's an incumbent that you're just going to acquire as a different acquisition model, or it could be an addition to or a replacement to what you already have that might be easier to consume that way, right? So there's lots of variables. The good news is at Insight, that portion of the CapEx, OpEx acquisition model, we've been doing that for 30 plus years, right? We know how to do all that stuff. Now what we have is just another tool in our bag of tricks for how do we actually consume that stuff. And that's the flexibility that clients are looking for, is how to go get this stuff in a more digestible way in this uncertain time that we live in, this COVID land, right? Because who knows? There's lots of different ways of behaving that are happening right now. There's those that are being more methodical about their spend. Some are becoming more aggressive about their spend, but they're wary about spending too much because things are so variable. So this is just another way of making sure that regardless of your reality, you can do it the right way.
Yeah, Jason, I think that was a brilliant question, even though it was off the cuff. And if I could, let me give you a real life example that exemplifies exactly what you're saying. It's a financial organization, and the kind of the first challenge they had was they were already pretty committed to cloud, and they're doubling down. And so it did start with storage, right? Because that's how they contacted us. Hey, you provide me, brand X storage, and this is my strategy, and I'm not going to go CapEx anymore because our strategy is cloud. And so we went in and we said, well, here's what we can do for storage as a service. But to your point, then they said, you know what, that really fits my model. Now, what are you going to do when some of this goes to cloud? And it's like, great, this guy has a cousin that happens to run in Google and AWS and Azure. So, you can kind of move that between here and there. Now, that storage provider didn't provide both of those. We did, right? So this is where Insight kind of comes in. And then he expanded the question, right? Now the meetings are getting bigger, and he's like, what can you do with compute? It's like, we have programs for compute, because you really are not just always buying just storage. What can you do for backup? So if you think about it, he's looking for a different consumption model, as Juan pointed out. Then he's saying, what can you make fit? And we are in a luxurious position because everybody who has as a service is coming to us going, okay, can you combine my compute with his storage, with his security and his backup? And we're like, yeah, no problem, including cloud.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and so Kent said something that was interesting there. He said the cousin. I want to be clear about what he meant by that. So some of the storage providers have the ability to run on-premises infrastructure. So the storage, whether it's NAS or SAN or combination of or whatever, right? They also provide the exact same operating system or even the exact same hardware in a public cloud provider, so that you can set up replications and you can set up mirrors, or if you have built your application to expect a certain type of behavior from your storage, you can run the exact same storage in the public cloud. So it's a replication, maybe a DR thing, or just a architectural thing, right? So that's part of the value proposition that these as a service things do, tied to what Kent said, which is, hey, if I build it over here, which is the on-premises, but I know that I'm gonna move it over to the public cloud, does that mean that I have to rebuild everything once I get it over here? And this allows you to at least take that out of consideration or minimize the need for the consideration of that. So, and it's a very important point. So I just wanted to make sure to expand on that one, right?
No, that's perfect. And so it sounds interesting. Both of you guys kind of talked about a situation where the scope increases related to this conversation within an organization, right? So like we go in and talk about this, and then it expands to more and more meaningful. I love to talk about that transformation aspect, since it's in our name, right? Do you have any advice? Like what do business leaders need to do? Do they need to take an initiative here? Is it the folks at the, in the business units, who typically is engaging you guys, and how can we kind of give some guidance to these folks as far as how they should approach something like this?
It is interesting because obviously most of the time we are talking to the technology people, but they're getting direction from the ivory tower, right? We're going to cloud. Now, we've all been in this discussion before. Sure you are. Have you talked to the app owners? There's all kinds of politics in cloud. That's our biggest challenge, right? But they're aware that that's what they're trying to do, and they want to play ball. And so, in the one case where the cloud is the risk to me as a technology guy, I'm building these infrastructures to do these mission critical applications, and the guys upstairs just said, we signed a $100 million agreement with the cloud guys, and now I have to give it there. And so he is actually, essentially a conduit to say, this is the mandate I'm getting. I can't buy CapEx anymore. I need to go to cloud. And sometimes as a service is a middle ground. It says, great, you can consume cloud, small asterisk. Some of this isn't in the public cloud yet because we can't figure out how to get it there. There's all kinds of issues with storage. Whole nother subject of, what happens when you move storage to cloud as Juan puts up. There's extra costs. It might be significantly more expensive. We'll get to that. But in the meantime, what I've done is the technology guy is now involved in the business conversation to say, our overall strategy is to do this, and here's how I'm going to do that with essentially a bridge strategy to get us from here to there. And you can have the same argument if it's just a overall business objective, but the cloud one is, I think, easier to visualize.
Yeah, another way to think about it too is business leaders are being asked to have more flexibility and to start up new technology solutions for whatever problem that they're trying to address. But they're also being told do it with less spend, right? So spend less, do more, right? And this is a way of achieving both of those, because you're not committing to a big spend, but you have the flexibility to do more until you actually prove that this has got a business case. And then at that point, it might make sense, tying back to my original dialogue there, it might make sense to make a CapEx purchase, or it might make sense to move it wholly to the public cloud, or it might make sense to create a hybrid model and then readjust your spend appropriately, right? So that's actually one of the things that we didn't talk about, is that these as a service things tend to have a very short commit period. So a year is typical, all right? So a year horizon, and then after that, there's no penalty for you to back out or any of those kinds of things, right? So your risk has been reduced dramatically, all right? So there's lots of options that this brings, and that's really typically, like I said, led from the executive suite down. The technology guys still have to do the technology stuff, all right? They just want to make sure that they have their stuff to do this with, and now you can bridge the gap between the two of them.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. We're not saying everybody should do this. If you have the budget to buy your infrastructure and you know what you need, you will probably save a certain amount of money by doing CapEx. And by the way, your financial guys wanted to do that, right? And so it's, it really makes sense when you have some uncertainty. One of those uncertainty variables is cloud. Another one is, my spending pattern given, budget constraints or uncertainty, et cetera. And to the point that Juan's making, some people will look at this and then compare it to CapEx and say, okay, I'm going to balance, let's say it's 20 points cheaper to buy up front versus the flexibility to rent and have all that flex up, flex down. Which one makes sense? And the third one might be, and what does it cost being cloud?
No, I'm smiling because that was literally the next question. I think you guys both really kind of hit the answer, but just let me kind of restate the question. We get into this, there's a lot of complexity here, right? And people get into this paralysis by analysis kind of perspective. And it sounds like, we were on a storage conversation on one of the last sessions we did, and they were like, do something. And this sounds like something that allows you to continue to move forward with the transformation you're trying to do, and then to continue to make some choices, less risky choices, as you've already engaged.
That's exactly right. This is a model that allows you to make a very low risk storage. So for example, a couple of our partners offer that storage thing, right? Their initial upfront investment is for 100 terabytes worth of capacity, which in today's world, that's very, very little, right? So you can consume 100 terabytes in a matter of hours if you have the right kind of application. So that's a low risk investment. And once you've proven or not proven whatever the business model is, or the project, or whatever it is that you're working on, that's great. You can continue to flex and grow. But if it turns out that that's not good, you can reallocate to another project or shut it down, and you've not done a lot. If it turns out that it's the wrong partner, that from a technology perspective, because of whatever reason, it's also low risk, because you don't have to sweat the asset for 3, 5, 7 years like you do when you do a CapEx, right? So it gives you that flexibility, right?
Yeah, and if I added one more thing, and I'll give you another real life example, but you're right, Jason. On the surface, this sounds complicated, right? It's a financial model and this and that, and this is how it compares to a lease and FASB, and oh my gosh, my head's exploding. It is actually fairly simple once you get in and talk to the business leader. So in this case, there was a federal organization, no shortage of money. They wanted to do a refresh to keep them on track for their transformational objective. And it started with storage, like a lot of these, right? I've got X million dollars of storage, what I'd like to consume now, but it's not in my budget for this year. That started the conversation. What can you do? Then we said, well, there are some additional ways to consume storage. And so initially it was just, can you fit this in this year's budget? And, there could have been a bunch of different outcomes. And by the way, they had no intention of public cloud, right? And so we came in and we presented this. They compared that. Like a lot of people are going to compare it to what would it cost to buy. And then they came up with the aha moment. Oh my gosh, this is awesome. It fits into this budget. And yeah, over 4 years, it costs a little bit more, but I have no visibility to my world in 4 years. I'm a federal agency. I could get tons of money coming in. I could have budget slashes. Who knows what's going to happen next year? So this is kind of a no-brainer for me. And then was kind of the cherry on top. I know there are people higher up the food chain here that want us to go to cloud. This is cloud, right? It's cloud consumption with small asterisk. It's running in my data center still. So, it seems complicated, but once they sit down with their world and their applications and their, objectives, does it fit? And sometimes it does. It's really been a popular discussion in 2020.
Yeah. The other thing to talk about on that one is that this isn't an all or nothing decision, right? So it's important to call that out as well, right? It could be that you stick with the same storage provider, the same compute provider, whatever it is that you're working with, but you choose as like, hey, this stuff I'm going to refresh. I know that's going to be around for a long time, and I don't need to worry about flexing. That is going to be a lower cost thing, right? But for this portion over here, maybe where I'm innovating, where there's some variability, my mission has changed, whatever that is, then let's try to consume that in a different way so that we have that option. And then you can combine the two of them and actually come up with a very compelling financial design that matches your technical architectural design. So it's not very hard. It's actually stuff that's pretty stable, do it this way. Stuff that's variable, do it this way. And that's it. That's the math that you end up having to do. Right?
And that's actually a very important point, right? So, storage vendor A can only provide storage. And some people are saying, look, I'll provide a bunch of stuff. And one of the things that we have the luxury of doing is saying, okay, if that's the way you want to consume, and whether it's storage or cloud or compute, we can actually combine them and say, okay, what projects do you want to do? What initiatives do you want to do to consume this way? Let us help you put that together and deliver that to you, as opposed to you going out to all the different stores and trying to figure out who's got the size and color I need for each one of them.
Gotcha. I love it. And just kind of popping up in the chat, somebody asked a question, so this isn't like managed services, but are there any kind of considerations if we have this as a service kind of consumption model with a storage provider, maybe a compute provider, do we still, from a security perspective, governance perspective, do we still kind of own this thing? Do we still manage it the way we?
That's a great question, and so there's some subtle details that we haven't covered because they're hidden in the different contracts that you would sign with each one of the providers, right? So some of them are fully managed services where you have a party that then becomes your operations team. right?
Okay.
And then you'd have to make sure that that partner, it could be us, it could be the provider, is integrating with your operations and works under your governance and under your security postures and all those kinds of things.
Gotcha.
Others, all they're doing is they're just changing how you acquire the stuff. You slide it into your environment, and then still your team that applies the
Business
same
as
rules
usual.
as they've had before, right?
Got it.
So, and there's in betweens. So you got to read the fine print. It's actually not that fine print. It's spelled out in bold letters in the very beginning of the document, right? So just read what it is, and we're certainly more than capable of helping with that. But in terms of GRC or security stances or operational principles, none of that really changes, because that's still really a business decision that the client has to make based on their business. And then this slides into that, and it's just part of that aspect. And you might have to tweak if there's a third-party management portion, right?
Yeah, a couple of things to add there. So part of it is, how do you manage it? And all of the as a services, we essentially offer multiple flavors of the managed service, right? One is what we call essential services. I'm going to do the monitoring, the billing, the client engagement, make sure you're getting what you wanted, et cetera, without requiring you to change operationally, right? Or a fully managed that says, you know what, in the cloud, I don't have to think about anything, right? And so will you take care of that for me? And then you go into, I think the governance is a big question. So in all of the as a service programs, the OEM owns the asset. So you never take title, right? And so that helps your accounting people, et cetera. And the way I think about this is if you consumed one of those storage providers that has it running in all the cloud providers, well, there's actually a physical asset sitting in that cloud provider. Whether you buy compute or storage or whatever, there's something physical. Right. Because you're not going to be in a public cloud. They're just putting cloud infrastructure in your data center. You don't own it. You can't sell it. You can't do bad things to it. But I will let you do some of the governance things that are tied into your organization today. So if you want to provision it, things like that. And Jason, you of all people knows well that just because you put it in the cloud doesn't mean that you secured it, that you backed it up,
What?
And you still have to do all that stuff too.
Yeah, exactly. No, and I think to your point, Kent, how you were talking about how we make it easy, I think, now we talked about that managed services aspect, we can package a lot of these pieces and parts up and offer it as a kind of turnkey solution as well. And some folks are looking for that.
Well, I think to your point, if you want us to make it easy and think about those things, like, did you think about security? Did you think about protection? We will make it easy for you, but some people are still doing their own thing. And this is a transition to say, okay, I like this consumption model, but I still want to play with it. And then I think even that federal agency that said, I'm going to start there, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to offload some of these tasks to you, is knowing that higher level of service was available. Sure.
And again, as a service model gives that flexibility.
Yep.
That's brilliant. So, gentlemen, to kind of wrap things up today, it's been a really cool conversation talking about the different models that exist, and the easy button versus the flexibility button versus the get it now button. There's all kinds of great things associated with this topic, but that leads me to this question I'm going to ask both of you is, where does somebody start?
So, well, reach out to us. It's a great way to do it. So,
besides the commercial,
besides the commercial, we've spent a considerable amount of time looking at all of these, understanding them from the financial aspect, but also understanding how their technical capabilities map out. And there's a lot that goes into understanding the technology portion. And you could, to your point earlier, you could absolutely get lost in the rat hole of analysis paralysis, because you start comparing the technologies, financial models, this, that, and all that other stuff. We've spent months figuring this stuff out. There's no need for you to do that. We're happy to share with you a digested version of that, to kind of use that word, right? And really match it to the client's needs. And because we have the flexibility of picking from a variety of choices, that's something that we can do without you having to invest a whole bunch of time, right? We'll also have some resources that we're going to be publishing on our website. So please feel free to peruse through those. There's a lot of good stuff in there. Kent spent quite a bit of time. I'm doing a commercial for Kent because he spent quite a bit of time doing this stuff. And he's written some great stuff. We've posted some great videos. There's a lot of material on this topic.
I think as Juan, typically his answer was very short, sweet, and reach out to us. That's the short answer, and it's 100% correct. I think the goal today was to provide awareness. A lot of people didn't realize this existed, and it really didn't in 2019. Analysts are starting to cover this. Gartner came in and said, oh, by the way, it was nothing in 2008 or 2019. It's now going to be 15 or 20, and that number's going up, right? So all of a sudden it's showing up. So just be aware that it exists. Educate yourself. As Juan says, we'll help you. There's now analysts are starting to cover this as, consumption-based infrastructure, different names for it, et cetera. Pretty much every OEM is going to say, I've got an as a service because it's a popular thing, whether it's a financing model or not. And then ultimately start to align that to your priorities as an organization. What are we trying to do? And is this something we should consider? And once they understand what they're trying to accomplish, this isn't that complicated taken in the context of their environment. We're trying to be broad, but when they're saying, this is what I'm trying to do, how does this fit? It's a lot easier.
Awesome. Well, gentlemen, it has been awesome. Thanks everybody out there for joining us for this lively conversation on as-a-service models. Thank you, Kent. Thank you, Juan. You guys are awesome, and I hope you'll come back and talk again. For those of you who want to access some additional resources related to this, like were mentioned, please visit us at insightcdct.com. Have a great day.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kent.